right, we're back with the next episode of Zeitgeist, and I'm here with Khalid from Palindrome. I'm Rauf from Palindrome. Khalid, how you doing?
Good.
Okay, so in the previous episode, we actually ended it by talking about industrialization, and that was pretty interesting. And this is actually going to segue. So basically, just to recap, right? We went from Vision 2020, which is a narrative, you can say, or you can say it's a storyline that interacts with an overall narrative. And what was interesting was the storyline that was projected way back then, right, was that Malaysia was going to be developed by 2020, but actually what we got in 2020 was COVID, right? So the narrative, so that is a case study in how the narrative and the storyline actually didn't fit, right? So anyway. And then the industrialization and the new industrialization that's currently happening with like electric cars and AI, semiconductors, robots, and stuff like that, right? This is all galvanizing Malaysia's industrial sector, right? From that, we have another interesting buzzword, right? Which is knowledge worker. Okay, we have two: knowledge worker and information age, right? So these two actually go together, right? Knowledge worker or a K worker, right, is a highly skilled person. And by the way, our PMX right now is actually, from what I understand, working on sort of bringing about more highly skilled workers, turning Malaysia into a highly skilled labor outsourcing kind of place, right? Instead of a lowly skilled labor kind of place, so that we have people who can design our own AI empowered semiconductor chipsets and stuff like that, right? But this word, knowledge worker, K worker, whatever it is, has been around for a while.
Yeah, it has. I mean, when we zoom on and we look at these two terms specifically, knowledge work, and what was the other one?
Information age. So there was this idea that there was going to be this great age of, and again, this is human beings trying to make sense of the world, right? So they go from the like you were talking about the agricultural age, industrial age, then they came up with this thing called the information age. I've heard of this thing called the story age as well, which pretty interesting as well.
I mean, depending on how we look at it, the information age is upon us. If we look at it as from the lens of, I mean, these two terms straight away go into the author Cal Newport, the computer scientist who wrote a collection of very interesting books, including Deep Work and A World Without Email. I think is his latest book. Very, very interesting opinions and ideas coming out from this one computer scientist. Very interesting things. He talks about the idea of knowledge work and the importance of knowledge work in relation to the information age. Again, as you mentioned, we are coming out of the previous economic sectors, as the economists may put it. The manufacturing sector. Before that, the agricultural sector. We moved from the agriculture sector to manufacturing. We moved out of manufacturing to the services sector.
But I mean, it's not that clean. There is some overlap, right?
Definitely, yeah. There's definitely overlap. But now, what we can see kind of clearly is that there is some distinction to be made in the sense that we are in an information age. Great majority of people around us, us and the viewers who may be watching, or the people who may be listening to this podcast as well, a lot of us sit in offices and do work with our brains. This is what Cal Newport describes essentially as what knowledge work is. Right, and what are we working on? We are working on things that basically reside or are consolidated within this overarching concept of the information age. We're working to build upon this idea of the information age. A lot of the work that we do is no longer based on physical labor or trade labor, although, of course, there is a great sector or a great portion of the population of any country, including this one, that focuses still on skilled labor and physical labor, and we're very much reliant on them for sure. But there's this kind of an overwhelming emphasis on knowledge work. So these two terms are interesting in their own right, and I think we should revisit them for sure.
Yeah. So and going from that, right? So we went from sort of the overarching words that fit within the concept of narratives and stuff like that. And then we went to industrialization. and segued into knowledge work and the information age, right? I mentioned Vision 2020 earlier on, right? But from that, so now we get into the digitization of things, basically, right? From that, we have a whole host of new terms, right? That actually have come about. I don't know how widely used they are. Maybe they are used by specialists, but actually a lot of them are used by people for different reasons with different agendas. Fake news. This is like Donald Trump's favorite word: fake news, fake news, right? So sort of like gaslighting you with different types of information that's brought in front of him, and he calls it fake news, right? So we have a whole host of new words that have basically spawned out of this digital age, right? Echo chamber, viral, disinformation, fake news, right? Let's go through these one by one. Let's start with echo chamber.
I mean, what's interesting about all of those words that you mentioned in sequence is that every era has a portion of every era is filled with positive sentiment, and then usually the latter parts of that era is filled with negative sentiment or optimism, slowly moving towards pessimism or nihilism. I think at this point in time, it's interesting to see that all of these words have a little bit of a negative sentiment around them. There used to be a point in time where a technological era was seen as something as enlightening, as hopeful, as positive, as empowering. These were words that were more heavily associated with the technology age. If you remember in the 90s, pre-90s, maybe even the 80s, so to speak, technology was seen as something of more positive sentiment. Now, sadly, we have seen the repercussions of a lot of the technology that has been pushed out, in relation to echo chambers, for example, as you mentioned. That is a specific term coined by, I forget who that person is, but he speaks about how social media networks and platforms and online platforms where there is natural and user-generated discourse, they isolate themselves into groups after a certain point, and they reaffirm their own beliefs to a level of intensity until it creates extremely polarized online climate, and it creates extremists, so to speak. So this is what we describe as echo chamber.
Yeah, especially can be seen on places like Twitter, right?
Oh, yeah.
And I mean, like I said, like to me, this basically, I mean, it's very nicely put, in my opinion, how you said that there was this hopeful, sort of as the light bringer kind of thing about technology, but there was also a dystopian edge to it. If you even look at like movies like Blade Runner and Johnny Mnemonic and stuff like that, there was this understanding that we didn't really know what we were getting into, right? And what we see today is basically you can see these are communication channels, right? And what it has highlighted, right, is how people think, right, and like you said, how polarized they are in their view modes of thinking. But not only that, right? How the machines, in sort of like a matrix kind of way, where the machines were actually creating the world, right? So to speak, that the human beings were living in the simulated world, right? Today, our children basically are being raised by algorithms, right?
Yeah. And these algorithms are there, and they put in place in the name of efficiency, as technology always is. But there are repercussions. I'm not a technocritic, so to speak. I believe in the power of technology. To some degree, even Cal Newport and the great linguists like Chomsky and Naqib Alatas, they talk about language as a kind of technology. You see, but generally speaking, I think that there are some repercussions, some negative implications that come with this algorithm-based kind of dystopian age that we're living in right now at this point in time. It is kind of dystopian, but it's I wrote about this. I called it an invisible kind of dystopia that we are living in. In our futurist sense, the futurist constructions in the 80s and the 90s and such showed the dystopian future as a little bit more jarring but really we are living in kind of a subtle dystopia where society is run very largely by algorithms. The author and data scientist Seth Stephens-Davidowitz talks about how we moved out of an era of religion, institutionalized religion in the West, at least, into humanism, atheistic humanism. And then we moved out of an age of atheistic humanism to data-ism, where we believe almost faith-like that data is in control of everything that we know, and we give it a free clearance to define everything that we love. That's data-ism. And I believe in the power of data as well. But to an extent, we're talking about absolutes or extremes, polarizations, as you mentioned. And I think algorithms really do feed into this era of really polarizing things, opinions, situations, ideologies. I mean, if you look at the gender wars that's happening online on YouTube, it's quite ridiculous. We have one movement that focuses on high levels of misogyny, and another movement that focuses on high levels of, you can say, toxic femininity.
Empowerment for women, yeah.
And so on and so forth. And they clash with each other. And I can go on and on. It's not just gender wars. We are also looking at political wars, religious wars. We're looking at social wars, also business wars. We're looking at how there's a polarized opinions about things like VC, venture capital, polarized opinions about things like mutual funds, polarized opinions about what kind of investment methods are the best, and so on and so forth. Yeah,
the polarization of sort of public discourse, right? In my opinion, leads back to your point earlier on about how human beings try to fit meaning into the world, basically. I mean, if you look at an election, right? An election is basically a yearly or like 4-yearly festival, right? Festival of polarization, right? You have, I kind of like that, a festival of polarization, right? You have two sides, right? And it basically I think it always seems to devolve to two sides, Republicans and Democrats, right? But in Malaysia, we basically recently started to have two sides develop, right? And they stand for two very interestingly, they tend to fall, like all over the world, fall within these two brackets, the far right, the far left, or the right and the left in general.
Yeah,
right?
And don't get me wrong. Polarization is a natural way of life. It's part of the natural life. Again, going back to the basics of human conditioning, we have this innate desire in us to develop what we know as enemy complexes. And what's interesting about the psychological study about enemy complexes is that it helps us to establish and define our own realities. We are happier when we know which enemies are ours and where the enemy is, and so on and so forth. We become less happy, more anxiety-ridden, and so on and so forth, when we have no enemies, or at least we don't know who to blame, who to point the finger to. And so I think the political dogma or the political machine or mechanism all around the world that happens, it serves to build up on this idea of the enemy complex. They rely, or they maybe even you might want to say weaponize or capitalize on the innate human condition to seek out enemies when even there are none. But it helps, again, as I mentioned, Michel Foucault talks about this idea of biopower. Michel Foucault's a great philosopher. He talks about biopower, where human beings we are designed as a society to put human beings in groups and use them to our advantage as a kind of form of power, as a form of fuel, so to speak. And so I think that's what the political mechanism is trying to do when we talk about using polarization in that sense. So polarization is not necessarily something to be completely disregarded. That's not what we're saying. We're talking about extremes. And I think, going back to what you're talking about with the algorithm age and all of this kind of stuff, we bring things into extremes. A nation, for example, that is too pulled apart by polarization is a nation that is in trouble. But it is also too idealistic to think that a nation has no polarization whatsoever, so on and so. Like, for example, Adam Smith in the Wealth of Nations, he talks about inequality. Ibn Khaldun talks about inequality in the Al-Muqaddimah. But it's not to say that a little bit of inequality is a big deal.
Capitalism as a system runs on inequality.
There we go.
It requires inequality.
Yeah, you can argue, and this is a narrative that can be challenged, we can argue that that is too idealistic to consider that there is no inequality whatsoever. Inequality may be part of life, what I call one of the inevitables. So that's something to be said.
You were mentioning something about warfare related, right? What was it again? That because I wanted to segue that into our narrative warfare concept. Anyway, never mind. Let's just continue with these digital age related words and terms. So, okay, so we went from echo chamber and we talked about how algorithms sort of perpetuate, not even perpetuate, I think they are actually creating it now. Because when a person, right, goes online, we're talking about digital communication, right? Which basically these channels basically run on recommendation engines, right? So when you step online, basically you are in a sense kind of like stepping further and further into your own head, right? And you are being served more and more of the types of content that the algorithm thinks that you want, right? And so on and so on and so on. So in a sense, there's nothing new to learn, right? And we talked about this briefly, I think, during our session on RTM, right? And basically our solutions to this were to actually, well, one of the solutions was to actively seek out and engage with the other side, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's something that's said by a lot of experts as well. I mean, Ray Dalio, in a lot of the interviews that and I think several of his books, including Principles, he talks about the idea of finding the ideal truths, right? And the ideal truth, the method to finding real, concrete truths is to have a strong idea and ideology, and then go and seek out extremely high-level intellectual minds who have a completely different kind of opinion as yours, and then to go and speak to them and to engage in discourse with them until finally you find some kind of interesting key points that the two of you can relate to, and that becomes kind of the truth, so to speak. So that's something interesting as well that we can consider. And I mean, if we move into the idea of building brands, and talking about the idea of how this relates to business, I do believe that some of the greatest and strongest brand building that I've seen when it comes to businesses and their communication channels are the ones that are open to free discourse, that do not shy away from what PMX in his speech spoke about, the contestation of ideas. I do think that there is something to be said about sharing ideas and not being afraid of having those ideas challenged and defending them when need be, or changing your mind if you realize that you are wrong. I think it is a great strength of character. I think it is a great showcase of the strength of your character, whether it's an individual or whether it's a company. So I do believe that that's something that should be incorporated into a lot of business communications today. Yeah.
And with that, we wrap up the next episode. Actually, we're still on the digital era terms, right? And I want to continue with them because this is super interesting. But let's leave the next part for the next episode.